standing in the manicured gardens of the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, watching my younger brother Marcus exchange vows with his radiant bride, I never imagined that within the next hour the President of the United States would personally intervene in what my father called the biggest disappointment of the Morrison family legacy. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Captain Sarah Morrison, and for the past 15 years, I've served as a cybersecurity specialist and intelligence analyst for the United States Air Force. But on this particular Saturday afternoon in early June, I was nothing more than an unwelcome shadow at what was being hailed as the social event of the season in Charlotte's elite circles. The wedding was everything my family valued: opulent, perfectly orchestrated, and designed to broadcast wealth and status to everyone who mattered in North Carolina's political and business elite. The bride, Victoria Ashworth, was the daughter of a prominent textile magnate, whose family had been weaving their influence through Southern politics for 3 generations. The ceremony took place beneath towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss, their ancient branches forming a natural cathedral that had been enhanced with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers suspended from carefully concealed rigging. I stood alone near the ornate ice sculpture of 2 swans, clutching a glass of sweet tea that had long since grown warm in the humid afternoon air. My simple black Nordstrom dress and modest pearl earrings felt painfully inadequate among the sea of designer gowns and custom-tailored suits that surrounded me. The other guests moved in fluid social clusters, their conversations punctuated by the kind of easy laughter that comes from shared privilege and mutual understanding. My mother, Patricia Morrison, glided past me with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of Southern hospitality. Her eyes barely acknowledged my presence as she paused just long enough to deliver a cutting observation disguised as maternal concern. "Honestly, Sarah," she whispered, her smile never faltering as she nodded to a passing judge and his wife, "I sent you money for something appropriate. That dress makes you look like you're attending a funeral instead of celebrating your brother's happiness." The criticism stung, but it was familiar territory. I had long since grown accustomed to being the family's perpetual disappointment, the daughter who had chosen service over society, duty over debutante balls, while my brother Marcus had followed the expected path, graduating from Duke University, earning his MBA from Wharton, and stepping seamlessly into the executive ranks of Morrison Holdings, our family's diversified investment firm. I had shocked everyone by accepting an appointment to the Air Force Academy immediately after high school. That decision, made 18 years ago, had created a rift in the Morrison family that had never truly healed. My parents had built their lives around a carefully curated image of Southern aristocracy, where tradition and appearances mattered more than individual achievement. My choice to pursue a military career was seen not as an act of patriotism or personal calling, but as a rejection of everything they had worked to build. The reception was held in the estate's grand ballroom, a cavernous space with soaring ceilings painted with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from classical mythology. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors that had been polished to mirror perfection. Round tables draped in ivory silk were arranged around a central dance floor, each setting featuring place cards written in elegant calligraphy and centerpieces of white orchids flown in specifically for the occasion. I found my assigned seat at table 12, strategically positioned at the far edge of the room near the service entrance. The placement was no accident. While my parents' closest friends and business associates enjoyed prime real estate near the head table, I had been relegated to what amounted to social Siberia, seated with distant cousins and family acquaintances who seemed equally bewildered by their peripheral status. The other occupants of table 12 included my great-aunt Millicent, a sharp-tongued octogenarian who had spent the cocktail hour loudly critiquing the floral arrangements, and Robert Chen, the teenage son of one of my father's business partners, who appeared more interested in his smartphone than the festivities surrounding him. The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, filled with long pauses and polite inquiries about the weather and the quality of the hors d'oeuvre. As the evening progressed, I watched my family perform their roles with practiced precision. My father, William Morrison, commanded attention wherever he moved through the room, his booming voice and confident handshake opening doors and sealing deals even at his son's wedding. He was a man who had built his fortune through a combination of inherited capital, strategic marriages, and an intuitive understanding of how power flowed through the interconnected networks of Southern business and politics. Marcus stood at the center of it all, resplendent in his custom tuxedo from Savile Row, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully navigated every expectation placed upon him. He moved through the reception like a politician working a crowd, shaking hands with judges, embracing bank presidents, and accepting congratulations from a who's who of regional influence makers. This was his element, his natural habitat, and he wore his success like a perfectly tailored suit. The contrast between my brother's triumphant evening and my own isolation became most apparent during the traditional father of the groom's speech. William Morrison rose from his seat at the head table, tapping his champagne flute with a silver knife to command attention. The room fell silent as hundreds of faces turned toward him, eager to hear the wisdom and wit that had made him a sought-after speaker at charity galas and political fundraisers throughout the Carolinas. "Friends, family, distinguished guests," he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom without the need for amplification. "Tonight we celebrate not just the union of two remarkable young people, but the joining of two families whose roots run deep in the rich soil of North Carolina tradition." He spoke eloquently about Marcus's achievements, detailing his academic honors, his rapid rise within Morrison Holdings, and his promise as the next generation of family leadership. The crowd murmured appreciatively as he painted a picture of a young man who had exceeded every expectation, who had embraced his responsibilities with grace and determination. Then, almost as an afterthought, his gaze swept across the room until it found me sitting in my distant corner. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that I had learned to recognize over the years. "Of course," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, "every family has its different paths. While Marcus has chosen to build upon our legacy here at home, his sister Sarah has pursued her own unique calling in the military." He paused, allowing a patronizing smile to play across his lips. "We're grateful for her service naturally, though we sometimes wonder what might have been if she had chosen to apply her considerable intelligence to more traditional endeavors." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatically phrased, but their meaning was unmistakable to anyone who knew our family dynamics. He was simultaneously acknowledging my existence and dismissing my achievements, paying lip service to military service while making it clear that he considered my career choice a waste of potential and a source of ongoing disappointment. A few polite chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind of nervous laughter that accompanies an uncomfortable moment that everyone recognizes but no one wants to address directly. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, but I maintained my composure, keeping my expression neutral as I had learned to do during countless briefings and high-pressure situations throughout my military career. The speech continued for several more minutes, focusing on hopes for the future, the importance of family tradition, and Marcus's bright prospects as a leader in both business and community affairs. When William finally raised his glass in a toast to the happy couple, the room erupted in enthusiastic applause and cheers. I raised my own glass mechanically, going through the motions while feeling increasingly disconnected from the celebration surrounding me. After the speech, I excused myself from table 12 and stepped out onto one of the ballroom's terraces, seeking refuge in the cooler evening air. The terrace overlooked the estate's formal gardens, where carefully manicured hedges created geometric patterns illuminated by strategically placed lighting. In the distance, the Blue Ridge Mountains formed a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. I stood alone at the marble balustrade, my hands resting on the cool stone as I tried to process the familiar mixture of hurt and resignation that always followed these family gatherings. The sound of music and laughter drifted out from the ballroom behind me, a reminder of the celebration I felt increasingly estranged from, despite being bound to it by blood and history. "Sadie?" The terrace doors opened behind me and I turned to see Marcus approaching, still radiant from the evening's festivities but wearing an expression of concern that seemed genuine. He had always been the one family member who made any effort to bridge the gap between my world and theirs, though his attempts were often complicated by his position as the family's golden child. "Hey sis," he said softly, joining me at the balustrade. "You doing okay out here? Mom was asking where you disappeared to." I managed a weak smile, touched by his concern despite everything. "Just needed some air. Beautiful night, isn't it?" He nodded, but I could see him struggling with something, the way he always did when he wanted to address the elephant in the room but wasn't sure how to begin. "Listen, Sarah, about what Dad said in there, I know that wasn't easy to hear." "It's fine, Marcus, really. I'm used to it by now." "But it's not fine," he insisted, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "You've accomplished incredible things. You're a captain in the Air Force, for God's sake. You've got security clearances I can't even pronounce. You've served overseas, made a real difference in the world. But somehow that doesn't seem to count for anything around here." His words carried more weight because they came from someone who had never struggled for family approval, who had never known what it felt like to be measured and found wanting by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The fact that he could see the unfairness of the situation gave me a small measure of comfort, even if it didn't change the fundamental dynamics that had shaped our family for decades. "The thing is," I said carefully, "I don't think Dad sees military service as a real career. To him, it's like I've been playing an extended game of dress-up for the past 15 years, instead of doing something that actually matters." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering this. "You know what's crazy? Some of the most successful people I know in business are former military. The discipline, the leadership experience, the ability to work under pressure, those are exactly the qualities that make great executives. But Dad seems to have this blind spot when it comes to your achievements." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights twinkle in the valley below. Despite our different paths, Marcus and I had maintained a closer relationship than I had with our parents. Perhaps because he had never felt threatened by my choices or seen them as a reflection on his own decisions. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. We turned to see my father emerging from the ballroom, his face flushed with champagne and the satisfaction of a successful evening. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having every room rearrange itself around his presence. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying a note of mild irritation. "Your mother was wondering if you'd left without saying goodbye. Again." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had developed a habit of slipping away early from family events, unable to endure the full evening of subtle slights and passive-aggressive commentary about my life choices. "Just getting some air, Dad. Congratulations on a beautiful wedding. You and Mom really outdid yourselves." He accepted the compliment with a slight nod, but I could see him studying me with the same calculating expression he wore when evaluating a potential investment. It was a look that had made me feel like a disappointing stock performance since childhood. "Well, I suppose we should be grateful you could make it at all," he said, his tone suggesting that my presence was more of an inconvenience than a blessing. "I know how busy you must be with your government work." The phrase government work carried the same dismissive weight that other people might use for hobby or pastime. In William Morrison's worldview, anything that didn't directly contribute to wealth accumulation or social advancement was essentially worthless, regardless of its actual importance or complexity. "Actually, Dad, Sarah's work is pretty fascinating," Marcus interjected, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward more positive territory. "She was telling me about some of the cybersecurity challenges the military faces. It's incredibly sophisticated stuff." Our father's expression remained unchanged, as if Marcus had just shared details about a particularly complex video game rather than matters of national security. "I'm sure it keeps her occupied," he said with studied indifference, "though I can't help wondering what she might have accomplished if she'd chosen to apply those same analytical skills to something with real-world impact." The casual dismissal of 15 years of service hit me like a physical blow. I felt my composure beginning to crack, the careful emotional control I had maintained throughout the evening finally reaching its breaking point. "Real-world impact?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying an edge that made both men take notice. "Dad, I've spent the last decade and a half protecting systems that keep this country running. I've worked on projects that prevent foreign adversaries from accessing critical infrastructure. I've helped design security protocols that protect everything from power grids to financial networks. If that's not a real-world impact, then I honestly don't know what is. William Morrison's face darkened slightly, not because he was angry, but because he was uncomfortable with any challenge to his authority or judgment. In his experience, disagreement was something to be managed and controlled, not engaged with or seriously considered. That's all very noble, Sarah, but at the end of the day, you're still just another government employee drawing a taxpayer-funded salary. You haven't built anything lasting, anything that creates value or generates wealth for future generations. You haven't established a legacy that your children can inherit and build upon. The words hung in the air between us like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. This was the fundamental disagreement that had driven a wedge between us for nearly 2 decades. His belief that the only meaningful accomplishments were those that could be measured in dollars and assets, versus my conviction that service and duty had their own inherent value. Before I could formulate a response, the quiet evening air was suddenly filled with a sound that none of us had expected, the distant but unmistakable roar of jet engines approaching from the east. The sound grew from a distant rumble to an unmistakable thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Biltmore estate. Conversations inside the ballroom faltered, as guests paused, mid-sentence. Champagne flutes frozen halfway to lips as hundreds of faces turned toward the windows with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. Marcus grabbed my arm, his face pale in the garden lighting. "What the hell is that?" I knew that sound better than my own heartbeat. 15 years of military service had taught me to identify aircraft by their engine signatures, and this particular combination of power and precision belonged to only one plane in the world. But that was impossible. It had to be something else. A commercial flight diverted from Charlotte Douglas, perhaps, or a military transport passing through restricted airspace. The noise intensified as whatever was approaching descended toward the estate grounds. Through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see wedding guests abandoning their tables and rushing toward the glass, their elegant evening wear creating a sea of confused faces pressed against the panes. The string quartet that had been providing background music stopped playing entirely, their instruments falling silent as even the musicians strained to understand what was happening outside. My father stood frozen beside us on the terrace, his usual commanding presence reduced to stunned silence. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, William Morrison found himself confronted with a situation that didn't respond to wealth, influence, or carefully crafted social connections. The approaching aircraft cared nothing for his status as one of North Carolina's most prominent businessmen, or his ability to open doors throughout the state's political establishment. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of uncertainty, "this is military, isn't it? Do you know what's happening?" Before I could respond, the aircraft came into view over the tree line, its distinctive blue and white livery unmistakable, even in the gathering dusk. The sight hit me like a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs and sending my mind reeling with disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not at my brother's wedding, where I had just been dismissed as a failed investment in the Morrison family portfolio. Air Force One descended majestically toward the estate's main lawn, its massive bulk somehow graceful despite its imposing size. The presidential aircraft's approach was flawless, a testament to the skill of pilots who represented the absolute pinnacle of their profession. Landing lights blazed like earthbound stars as the plane touched down on grass that had been meticulously maintained for aesthetic perfection rather than aviation purposes. The impact of the landing sent tremors through the ground beneath our feet. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear car alarms triggered by the vibrations, their electronic protests adding to the surreal symphony of the moment. The estate's security staff appeared confused and overwhelmed, speaking frantically into radios while trying to manage wedding guests who had abandoned all pretense of polite behavior and were now streaming out of the ballroom onto the terraces and grounds. As Air Force One's engines wound down to a whisper, the silence that followed felt almost oppressive. The only sounds were the distant murmur of hundreds of voices and the soft rustle of evening wind through the oak trees. Even the insects seemed to have been shocked into silence by the unprecedented arrival of the most famous aircraft in the world. Marcus was the first to break our stunned paralysis. That's actually Air Force One, isn't it? The president's plane? I managed a weak nod, still struggling to process what I was witnessing. In 15 years of military service, I had never been within miles of the presidential aircraft. My work in cybersecurity, while critical to national defense, had never brought me into contact with the highest levels of government. I was a specialist, a technical expert, not a policymaker or senior official who might warrant presidential attention. The aircraft's main door opened with mechanical precision, and a set of stairs unfolded like something from a carefully choreographed performance. Secret Service agents emerged first, their movements crisp and professional as they established a security perimeter around the plane. They wore the standard black suits and earpieces that had become iconic symbols of presidential protection, but their presence here, at a private wedding in North Carolina, seemed to exist outside the boundaries of reality. More agents followed, spreading out across the lawn with the fluid efficiency of a military unit. They ignored the hundreds of wedding guests who watched from the terraces and gardens, maintaining their focus on securing the immediate area around Air Force One. Their professionalism was absolute, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes as they took in the surreal juxtaposition of a presidential visit to what was clearly a society wedding. Inside the ballroom, chaos reigned as guests abandoned all semblance of proper etiquette in their eagerness to witness history in the making. Women kicked off their heels to run across the marble floors, their designer gowns hiked up to avoid tripping as they raced toward the windows. Men loosened their bow ties and pushed through crowds with uncharacteristic urgency, their usual Southern gentility forgotten in the face of unprecedented excitement. My mother appeared at the terrace doors, her face a study in conflicting emotions. Patricia Morrison had spent decades perfecting her role as a Southern hostess. But nothing in her extensive social experience had prepared her for the arrival of the President of the United States at her son's wedding reception. Her usual composure was cracking under the weight of circumstances that existed far beyond her considerable sphere of influence. "William," she called to my father, her voice pitched higher than usual with stress and confusion, "do something. This is Marcus's wedding day. We can't have, whatever this is, disrupting everything we've planned." But for once, William Morrison found himself completely powerless. His wealth meant nothing to the Secret Service agents securing the perimeter. His political connections were irrelevant in the face of presidential authority. His ability to control situations through force of personality and financial leverage had no application when confronted with the most powerful office in the world. A figure appeared in the doorway of Air Force One, silhouetted against the aircraft's interior lighting. Even from our distance on the terrace, the unmistakable profile was instantly recognizable to every American who had ever watched a news broadcast or seen a newspaper. President Catherine Walsh stepped onto the platform at the top of the stairs, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person on the estate grounds. President Walsh was known for her direct communication style and her background as a former prosecutor who had built a reputation for taking on corruption in state government before ascending to national politics. She possessed the kind of gravitas that came from years of making decisions that affected millions of lives, but tonight she seemed almost relaxed as she surveyed the wedding reception that had been transformed into an impromptu state visit. She began her descent down the aircraft stairs, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Behind her, a small entourage of advisors and additional Secret Service personnel followed at a respectful distance, their movements synchronized with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. The president reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled wedding guests who watched from every available vantage point on the estate. She seemed to be searching for something or someone specific, her eyes methodical and purposeful as they scanned the crowd of faces staring back at her from the terraces and gardens. Then, impossibly, her gaze found mine. President Walsh's eyes locked onto mine with laser-like intensity, and I felt as though the rest of the world had suddenly ceased to exist. The hundreds of wedding guests, the magnificent estate, even my own family standing beside me on the terrace. Everything faded into background noise as the President of the United States focused her complete attention on me. She raised her hand in what appeared to be a greeting, but her gesture was clearly directed at me specifically, not at the crowd of onlookers who surrounded us. The realization sent a jolt of electricity through my body, a combination of terror and excitement that I had never experienced in 15 years of military service. "Sarah," Marcus whispered beside me, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. I think she's looking at you." My father turned to stare at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine surprise. For a man who prided himself on knowing everyone worth knowing and understanding all the connections that mattered in his world, the sight of the president acknowledging his dismissed daughter was clearly causing a fundamental recalibration of his assumptions. "What is this about, Sarah?" he demanded, his voice carrying an edge of panic that I had never heard before. "Why would the President of the United States be here? What have you done?" But I had no answers to give him. I was as stunned as everyone else by the unprecedented turn of events. My work in cybersecurity, while classified and important, had never brought me to the attention of anyone beyond my immediate chain of command. I was a technical specialist, not a policy advisor or strategic planner who might warrant presidential recognition. President Walsh began walking across the lawn toward the estate, her Secret Service detail maintaining their protective formation around her, while allowing her to move with purpose toward her apparent destination. The wedding guests parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path through their ranks while craning their necks to get a better view of the unfolding drama. As she approached the terrace where we stood, I found myself straightening automatically into military posture, my spine snapping to attention despite the fact that I was wearing civilian clothes at a family wedding. 15 years of conditioning took over, overriding my confusion and disbelief with ingrained respect for the chain of command that ultimately led to the woman now walking directly toward me. The president reached the base of the terrace steps and paused, looking up at our small group with a slight smile that seemed both genuine and purposeful. When she spoke, her voice carried easily across the sudden silence that had fallen over the entire reception. "Captain Morrison," she said, her words clear and unmistakable to every person within hearing distance. "I apologize for interrupting your family celebration, but I'm afraid we have an urgent matter that requires your immediate attention." The formal acknowledgement of my rank and the direct request for my assistance sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. I could hear gasps and whispered conversations erupting among the wedding guests as they tried to process what they were witnessing. This was no longer a society wedding that had been accidentally interrupted by a presidential visit. This was a targeted engagement, a deliberate mission that had brought the most powerful person in the world to seek out someone they had all dismissed as irrelevant. My father's face had gone completely white, his usual commanding presence reduced to slack-jawed amazement. The man who had spent the evening dismissing my career as meaningless government work was now confronted with the reality that the president herself apparently valued my expertise enough to personally seek me out during a family celebration. "Ma'am," I managed to respond, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I'm at your service." President Walsh nodded approvingly, then turned to address the crowd of wedding guests who hung on her every word. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll understand that matters of national security sometimes require us to interrupt even the most joyous occasions. I promise to return Captain Morrison to you as soon as possible, so you can continue celebrating this beautiful wedding." The crowd murmured its understanding, though I could see that most of them were still struggling to comprehend what was happening. These were people accustomed to wealth and influence, but presidential visits existed on an entirely different level of power and importance. As President Walsh climbed the terrace steps toward me, I caught sight of my mother's face in my peripheral vision. Patricia Morrison looked as though she might faint from the shock of seeing her dismissed daughter personally summoned by the President of the United States. The careful social hierarchies that governed her world had just been completely upended by forces she couldn't understand or control. The president reached the top of the steps and extended her hand to me with a warm smile that seemed remarkably genuine given the circumstances. "Captain Morrison, it's an honor to finally meet you. Your country needs you tonight." President Walsh's handshake was firm and confident, but I could detect an underlying tension in her grip that suggested the gravity of whatever situation had prompted this unprecedented visit. Her eyes held the kind of focused intensity I had seen in commanding officers during crisis situations, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ma'am, I'm honored by your presence, but I have to admit I'm completely in the dark about why you're here," I said, maintaining eye contact despite the surreal nature of our conversation taking place on a wedding reception terrace with hundreds of witnesses. "Captain, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," President Walsh replied, her voice dropping to a tone that wouldn't carry to the nearby guests who were straining to overhear every word. 3 hours ago, we detected a sophisticated cyber attack targeting our most critical defense infrastructure. The attackers have penetrated systems that control everything from satellite communications to nuclear facility security protocols. The words hit me like ice water injected directly into my bloodstream. In my field, this was the nightmare scenario that kept security analysts awake at night. A coordinated assault on the digital backbone that kept America functioning. The fact that the attack had reached levels requiring presidential intervention meant we were potentially facing a threat that could cripple the country's ability to defend itself. Initial analysis suggests this isn't the work of typical cybercriminal organizations or even standard nation-state actors, the president continued, her expression growing more grave with each word. The level of sophistication and the specific systems being targeted indicate access to classified information about our defensive architectures. We believe we're dealing with someone who has intimate knowledge of our most protected networks. My mind immediately began racing through the implications. Attacks of this magnitude required months or even years of preparation, along with resources that only a handful of entities worldwide possessed. But more disturbing was the president's suggestion that the attackers had inside knowledge of systems that were supposed to be invisible to external threats. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm sure you have teams of analysts at the Pentagon and NSA working on this. Why come to me specifically?" President Walsh glanced around at the wedding guests who continued to watch our every movement, then back to me with an expression that conveyed both urgency and something approaching desperation. "Because, Captain Morrison, the attack signature matches defensive protocols you designed for the Advanced Persistent Threat Response System. Protocols that exist in only 3 classified databases worldwide." The revelation struck me like a lightning bolt. The APTRS was a project I had spent 2 years developing during my assignment at Cyber Command headquarters in San Antonio. It was designed to identify and counter exactly the kind of sophisticated, long-term infiltration that the president was describing. The system was so classified that even acknowledging its existence required special authorization. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Those protocols were never implemented. The project was scrapped during budget cuts last year. The entire program was classified as never existed, and all documentation was supposed to be destroyed." "Supposed to be," the president repeated, her emphasis on those words carrying ominous implications. "But someone clearly retained copies of your work, and now they're using your own defensive strategies to mount an offensive that could bring down our entire cyber defense grid." The magnitude of the betrayal began to sink in. Someone with access to my most sensitive work had not only preserved it when it should have been eliminated, but had found a way to weaponize it against the very systems it was designed to protect. It was like discovering that your own child had been turned against you by forces you couldn't see or understand. Behind me, I could hear my father attempting to insert himself into the conversation, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used when addressing subordinates in his business empire. "Mr. President, perhaps we could continue this discussion somewhere more private. This is my son's wedding, and while we're honored by your presence, surely whatever government matter this involves could be handled through appropriate channels." President Walsh turned to face him with a look that could have frozen molten steel. She had spent years dealing with politicians and business leaders who believed their wealth or influence gave them the right to dictate terms to the federal government, and her patience for such presumption had clearly been exhausted long ago. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that ended conversations rather than starting them, "what we're discussing involves threats to national security that make your business concerns seem rather trivial by comparison. Your daughter's expertise may be the only thing standing between this country and a cyber attack that could shut down everything from power grids to water treatment facilities." The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through my father's sense of importance and leaving him speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. William Morrison was accustomed to being the most important person in any room, but he had just been reminded that there were levels of power and responsibility that existed far beyond his considerable sphere of influence. President Walsh turned back to me, her expression softening slightly as she registered the shock that must have been written across my face. "Captain, I need you to come with me to a secure facility where our best analysts are trying to understand how your defensive protocols have been turned into offensive weapons. Time is not on our side here." "How much time do we have?" I asked, my training automatically shifting into crisis mode as I began mentally cataloging the resources and procedures that would be required to address a threat of this magnitude. "Our preliminary assessment suggests the attackers are still in the reconnaissance phase, mapping vulnerabilities and testing response times," she replied. "But based on the sophistication of their approach, we estimate they could launch a full-scale assault within the next 6 to 8 hours. If they succeed, they could potentially disable our early warning systems, disrupt military communications, and compromise the security of installations that house our most sensitive assets." The timeline sent a chill down my spine. 8 hours wasn't nearly enough time to mount an effective defense against an enemy who had apparently spent months or years preparing for this moment. It would be like trying to stop a tsunami with a handful of sandbags, except the consequences of failure could affect the security of the entire nation. I glanced back at my family, who were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to growing comprehension that something far more serious than a simple government consultation was unfolding before their eyes. Marcus looked concerned but supportive, while my mother appeared to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance of seeing her dismissed daughter at the center of a presidential crisis. "Ma'am, I'll need to change into uniform and gather some personal equipment from my apartment," I said, already mentally inventorying the specialized hardware and software tools I kept at home for emergency situations. "Already handled," President Walsh replied with a slight smile. "We have everything you need aboard Air Force One, including a fresh uniform in your exact size. My staff is remarkably thorough when it comes to preparation." The efficiency was both impressive and slightly unsettling. The fact that the president's team had anticipated my needs and prepared accordingly suggested a level of planning that went far beyond a spontaneous decision to seek my assistance. This had been a carefully orchestrated operation, which raised questions about how long they had known about the attack and why they had waited until now to involve me. As we prepared to leave the terrace, my father made one final attempt to assert some control over the situation. "Sarah, surely this can wait until tomorrow. It's Marcus's wedding day, for heaven's sake. Whatever computer problem the government is having, it can't be so urgent that it requires disrupting our family celebration." The casual dismissal of a national security crisis as a computer problem perfectly encapsulated everything that had always frustrated me about my family's inability to understand or value my work. But before I could respond, President Walsh stepped forward with an expression that could have melted titanium. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "what your daughter does isn't playing with computers. She designs the digital armor that protects this country from enemies who would love to see us reduced to chaos and ruin. Tonight that armor has been compromised, and she may be our only hope of preventing a catastrophe that would make September 11th look like a minor inconvenience." The comparison hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. These were people who remembered exactly where they were when the Twin Towers fell, who understood that threats to national security could materialize without warning and change everything in a matter of hours. The casual dismissal of my work evaporated as the reality of the situation began to penetrate their consciousness. My mother stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Sarah, go. Do whatever you need to do. We'll explain to the guests, and the reception can wait." It was perhaps the first time in my adult life that Patricia Morrison had prioritized my responsibilities over social appearances, and the gesture meant more to me than she could possibly understand. Even Marcus nodded his agreement, despite the fact that we were talking about abandoning his wedding reception for an indefinite period. "Thank you," I said simply, looking at each of them in turn. "I'll be back as soon as I can." President Walsh gestured toward Air Force One, where the stairs remained extended and Secret Service agents maintained their vigilant perimeter. "Captain, your country is waiting." As we walked across the lawn toward the aircraft, I could feel hundreds of eyes following our every step. The wedding guests had been transformed from celebration participants into witnesses to history, though they couldn't possibly understand the full implications of what they were seeing. Some held up phones to record the moment, while others simply stared in stunned silence at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. The closer we got to Air Force One, the more surreal the situation became. The presidential aircraft dominated the estate's carefully manicured lawn like a metallic mountain, its presence a stark reminder of the power and reach of the office it represented. This wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of American authority that had touched down in the heart of North Carolina's social elite to retrieve a woman those same elites had spent the evening dismissing as irrelevant. As we reached the base of the aircraft stairs, President Walsh paused and turned back toward the wedding reception, where guests still crowded every available viewing point to watch our departure. She raised her hand in a brief wave that acknowledged their presence, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of grace under pressure that had made her one of the most effective presidents in recent memory. "Captain," she said as we began climbing the stairs, "I hope you're ready for the most important mission of your career." Looking back one final time at my family standing on the terrace, I saw my father's face clearly for the first time since Air Force One had appeared overhead. The confusion and dismissiveness had been replaced by something I had never seen there before when looking at me. Respect tinged with what might have been the beginning of understanding. "Ma'am," I replied as we reached the aircraft door, "I've been ready my entire life." Stepping aboard Air Force One was like entering an alternate universe where every surface gleamed with purpose and precision. The interior bore no resemblance to commercial aircraft, instead resembling a flying command center designed to maintain presidential operations from 30,000 feet. Rich Navy carpeting absorbed our footsteps as we moved through corridors lined with communications equipment that could connect the president to any location on Earth within seconds. A Navy steward appeared immediately, his uniform immaculate and his demeanor professionally welcoming, despite the unusual circumstances of our boarding. "Captain Morrison, we have your uniform and equipment ready in Conference Room 2. The President's briefing materials are already loaded on the secure workstation." The efficiency was staggering. In the 20 minutes since Air Force One had landed, the presidential staff had somehow procured a dress blue uniform in my exact measurements, assembled my personal equipment from my apartment, and prepared classified briefing materials for a crisis I had only learned about moments earlier. This level of preparation suggested they had been monitoring the situation and planning my involvement long before the attack had reached critical stages. President Walsh guided me through a maze of compartments that served different functions aboard the aircraft. We passed her personal office, equipped with secure phone lines and video conferencing capabilities that could transform any location into an extension of the Oval Office. Adjacent spaces housed communications specialists, Secret Service command posts, and medical facilities that could handle anything from routine checkups to emergency surgery at altitude. "Your reputation precedes you, Captain," the President said as we walked. "When I was briefed on the APTRS project 18 months ago, your commanding officers described you as the most innovative cybersecurity analyst they had encountered in 2 decades of service. They said you think like the enemy, which makes you uniquely qualified to defend against threats others can't even imagine." The praise felt surreal after spending an evening being dismissed as a disappointment by my own family. Here was the most powerful person in the world, acknowledging expertise that my father couldn't even comprehend, let alone value. It was a reminder that worth and accomplishment existed on multiple levels, and that sometimes the people closest to you were the least qualified to judge your contributions to the world. Conference Room 2 functioned as a mobile situation room, with multiple screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from agencies across the government. The central workstation featured the kind of advanced computing power typically found only in the most classified facilities, connected to networks that could access everything from satellite imagery to the personal communications of foreign leaders. An Air Force colonel named Jennifer Hayes was waiting for us, her expression grim as she gestured toward the display showing the scope of the cyber attack. "Captain Morrison, we've been tracking this intrusion for approximately 4 hours now. The attackers are demonstrating capabilities we've never encountered before. The screens showed network diagrams that looked like circulatory systems under attack by a virus. Red indicators marked compromised nodes throughout the defense infrastructure, while yellow warnings flagged systems showing suspicious activity that hadn't yet been fully penetrated. The pattern was methodical and sophisticated, suggesting adversaries who understood our defensive architecture better than many of our own analysts. "Show her the authentication logs," President Walsh instructed, settling into a chair that had been positioned to give her optimal viewing angles of all the displays. Colonel Hayes manipulated the interface to bring up a new screen filled with data that made my blood run cold. The attack wasn't just sophisticated, it was using access credentials that matched the authorization protocols I had developed for the APTRS system. Someone wasn't just copying my work, they were using my own digital signature to gain access to systems I had helped design. "This is impossible," I said, leaning closer to examine the authentication patterns. "These credentials were never distributed outside the development team. Only 4 people had access to this level of the system architecture. 3, actually," Colonel Hayes corrected grimly. "Dr. Michael Chen, the project's lead mathematician, died in a car accident 6 months ago. That leaves you, myself, and Dr. Patricia Volkov from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency." The name hit me like a physical blow. Patricia Volkov had been my mentor during the APTRS development, a brilliant scientist who had guided my work and helped me refine the defensive algorithms that were now being used against us. She was a naturalized citizen who had emigrated from Russia 15 years earlier, but her loyalty had never been questioned during multiple security clearances and background investigations. "Where is Dr. Volkov now?" President Walsh asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. "That's part of our problem," Colonel Hayes replied. "She requested emergency leave 3 weeks ago, citing a family illness in Moscow. We lost contact with her 5 days ago when she failed to check in according to protocol. Russian authorities claim no knowledge of her whereabouts." The implications were staggering. If Patricia Volkov had defected and taken copies of the APTRS protocols with her, she could have provided foreign intelligence services with blueprints for attacking every defensive system I had ever worked on. Worse, her intimate knowledge of my analytical methods would allow enemy hackers to anticipate and counter virtually any response we might mount. "Ma'am, if Dr. Volkov has compromised the entire APTRS architecture, we're not just dealing with a cyber attack," I said, my mind racing through the strategic implications. "We're facing someone who knows exactly how we think, how we respond to threats, and where our weaknesses are hidden." President Walsh nodded grimly, "which is why traditional countermeasures have proven ineffective. Every defensive protocol we've deployed has been anticipated and neutralized before it could take effect. The attackers are always 3 steps ahead because they're using your own analytical framework to predict our responses." The situation was even worse than I had initially understood. This wasn't just about stolen technology or compromised systems. It was about the betrayal of trust by someone I had considered a friend and mentor. Patricia had seen my work in its rawest form, understood my thought processes, and witnessed the development of techniques that existed nowhere else in the cybersecurity community. "We need to assume that everything we've developed over the past 3 years has been compromised," I said, settling into a workstation chair and beginning to examine the attack patterns more closely. "But that might actually give us an advantage." "How so?" Colonel Hayes asked, moving to look over my shoulder as I began analyzing the data streams. "Because if they're using my own methods against us, I understand their approach better than anyone else possibly could. I know the weaknesses in my own work, the assumptions I made that seemed reasonable at the time but could be exploited by someone who understood the underlying logic." I began pulling up diagnostic tools that could examine the attack from angles that weren't obvious to traditional security analysis. The APTRS system had been designed to identify patterns in enemy behavior, but those same pattern recognition algorithms could be turned inward to identify vulnerabilities in our own defensive posture. "The attackers are being methodical because they're following protocols I established for thorough network reconnaissance," I explained as data began flowing across the screens. "But that methodical approach creates its own vulnerabilities. If I can identify their progression pattern, I might be able to predict their next targets and get ahead of them." President Walsh leaned forward, studying the displays with the intense focus of someone who understood that the next few hours could determine the security of the entire nation. What do you need? Access to the original APTRS development servers, I replied immediately. The ones that were supposed to be destroyed when the project was terminated. If copies of my work still exist in our systems, I can use them to trace exactly what information Dry Volkov might have taken, and how she's deploying it against us. Colonel Hayes exchanged a glance with the president before responding. Captain, those servers were air-gapped and stored in a secure facility in Colorado. Even if we could access them remotely, the authentication protocols would require physical presence and biometric verification. Then we go to Colorado, President Walsh said without hesitation. Captain, how long would you need to analyze the original data and develop countermeasures? I considered the complexity of what we were facing. Rebuilding defensive protocols from scratch while under active attack was like performing surgery on yourself while being shot at, but it might be our only option for getting ahead of adversaries who knew our every move. Give me 6 hours with unrestricted access to the development environment, and I can build new defensive algorithms that even Dr. Volkov wouldn't be able to predict. But we'd need to deploy them simultaneously across all compromised systems, and we'd only get one chance to surprise them. The timing is tight, Colonel Hayes observed. Our intelligence estimates suggest the attackers will be ready to launch their primary assault within 8 hours. That would give us a maximum 2-hour window to implement whatever countermeasures you develop. President Walsh stood up, her expression resolute. Then we'd better get moving. Colonel, contact Peterson Air Force Base and tell them to prepare the APTRS facility for immediate access. Captain Morrison, I hope you're ready for the most important all-nighter of your career. As Air Force One's engines spun up for takeoff, I found myself thinking about the evening that had started with my father's dismissive comments about my meaningless government work. In the span of a few hours, that same work had become critical to preventing a cyber attack that could cripple the country's ability to defend itself. Through the aircraft's windows, I could see the lights of the Biltmore estate growing smaller as we climbed into the night sky. My brother's wedding reception was continuing without me, but I suspected the guests would have plenty to discuss even in my absence. The arrival of Air Force One had transformed a society gathering into a story that would be retold for decades, marking the moment when the family disappointment became the center of a presidential crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my family had measured success in terms of wealth accumulation and social status, viewing my military service as a waste of potential that could have been better applied to business pursuits. Now, as Air Force One carried me toward what might be the most critical mission of my career, I realized that true value couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or country club memberships. Captain, President Walsh said, appearing beside my seat as I gazed out at the lights of North Carolina disappearing below us. I want you to know that regardless of what happens tonight, your service has already made a difference. The protocols you developed may have been compromised, but the thinking behind them represents exactly the kind of innovation our country needs to stay ahead of evolving threats. Thank you, ma'am. I just hope we can turn this situation around before it's too late. We will, she replied, with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down challenges that would have broken lesser leaders, because sometimes the best defense against your own work being used against you is to understand it better than anyone else ever could. As Air Force One banked westward toward Colorado, I settled back into my seat and began mentally preparing for the battle ahead. Somewhere in cyberspace, enemy hackers were using my own innovations to attack the country I had sworn to defend, but they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the woman who created those innovations in the first place. The Rocky Mountains emerged from the darkness like sleeping giants as Air Force One descended toward Peterson Air Force Base. From the aircraft's windows, I could see Denver's sprawling lights giving way to the stark wilderness of Colorado Springs, where some of America's most classified military installations were hidden among peaks that had watched over continental defense since the Cold War began. Peterson Air Force Base materialized below us as a constellation of runway lights cutting through the high-altitude darkness. The base served as headquarters for NORAD and the Air Force Space Command, making it one of the most strategically important military installations in North America. Somewhere in the mountains beyond those lights lay the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, where the original APTRS development servers waited in their hermetically sealed vault. Colonel Hayes had spent the flight coordinating with base security to arrange our arrival, but even presidential authority couldn't entirely bypass the elaborate protocols designed to protect the nation's most sensitive cyber warfare assets. The facility we needed to access existed in a state of technological lockdown so complete that it required multiple layers of authentication even to acknowledge its existence. "The base commander is waiting for us," Colonel Hayes reported as Air Force One touched down with barely a whisper on Peterson's runway. "General Martinez has been read into the situation, but access to the APTRS vault will still require your personal biometric authentication and mine simultaneously. The system was designed to prevent any single individual from accessing the complete development environment." President Walsh gathered her briefing materials as the aircraft taxied toward a secure hangar that had been cleared specifically for our arrival. "Captain, once we're inside the facility, you'll have complete autonomy to work however you need to. My staff will handle communications with other agencies, but the technical response is entirely in your hands." The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. In the next few hours, I would essentially be racing against time to outsmart myself, to find weaknesses in my own work that could be exploited to defeat an enemy who understood my methods better than I did. It was like playing chess against a grandmaster who had studied every game you had ever played. The secure hangar was a cathedral of steel and concrete designed to shield visiting aircraft from both hostile surveillance and the harsh Colorado weather. As we disembarked, I was struck by the thin mountain air that made each breath feel inadequate, a reminder that we were operating at an altitude where even simple physical tasks required additional effort. General Elena Martinez met us at the aircraft steps, her bearing reflecting the kind of command presence that came from years of overseeing operations that could determine the survival of civilizations. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 50s. With the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that suggested she understood the technical implications of our mission, as well as its strategic importance. "Madam President, Captain Morrison," she said, offering crisp salutes that were returned with equal precision. "The APTRS facility has been brought online and is awaiting your arrival. We've also established a secure communication link with the Pentagon, so you can coordinate with response teams in real time." A convoy of armored vehicles waited to transport us from the hangar to the mountain facility. The ride through the darkness was eerily quiet, with only the sound of tires on asphalt and the distant whisper of wind through the peaks surrounding us. Security checkpoints appeared at regular intervals, each one requiring additional verification before allowing us to proceed deeper into the complex. The APTRS facility existed inside Cheyenne Mountain itself, accessible only through a tunnel that led into chambers carved from solid granite. The entrance resembled something from a science fiction film, with blast doors thick enough to withstand nuclear attack and security systems that scanned everything from retinal patterns to DNA samples before granting access. The original development environment has been maintained exactly as it was when the project was terminated, General Martinez explained as we passed through the final security checkpoint. "Nothing has been altered or updated, which means you'll be working with the same tools and datasets you used 3 years ago." The main laboratory was a sterile chamber filled with workstations that hummed with barely contained computational power. Banks of servers lined the walls, their status lights creating a constellation of red and green indicators that pulsed in rhythm with data processing cycles. The air smelled of ozone and climate control systems, while the constant background noise of cooling fans provided a technological heartbeat that never stopped. I settled into the primary workstation where I had spent countless hours developing the algorithms that were now being used against us. The familiar interface brought back memories of late nights spent refining code and testing scenarios that had seemed like theoretical exercises at the time. Now those same theoretical exercises were playing out in real time against actual adversaries. "Colonel Hayes, I need you to bring up the original threat modeling we did during Phase 3 of development," I said, my fingers already flying across the keyboard as muscle memory took over. Specifically the scenarios where we tested our own defenses against hypothetical attacks. The data appeared on multiple screens around the laboratory, displaying network topologies and attack vectors, that we had developed to test the robustness of our defensive protocols. Hidden within those test scenarios were the very weaknesses that Dr. Volkov was now exploiting. But they were buried under layers of complexity that would take hours to unravel. I need to understand her timeline, I muttered, pulling up communication logs from the original development period. Patricia was always methodical in her approach. If she's following the same logical progression she used during development, I might be able to predict her next moves. President Walsh had taken a position where she could observe my work without interfering, occasionally receiving updates from her staff about the broader situation developing across the country. The attack was continuing to spread through government networks, but the pace remained measured and deliberate, suggesting that the adversaries were still in preparation phases. As I dove deeper into the original code, patterns began to emerge that I had forgotten over the years since the project ended. Patricia had contributed brilliantly to the development process, but her suggestions had always followed certain logical frameworks that reflected her academic background in Russian mathematical theory. Those same frameworks were now visible in the attack signatures we were tracking. "She's using Markov chain analysis to predict our defensive responses," I said, looking up from the screens with growing excitement. "It's elegant, but it has a fundamental weakness that she probably doesn't realize." Colonel Hayes moved to examine the data I was highlighting. "What kind of weakness?" "Markov chains assume that future states depend only on current conditions, not on the complete history of previous states," I explained, my mind racing with possibilities. "But the APTRS system was designed to learn from historical patterns, not just current ones. If I can create enough false historical data, I might be able to trick her algorithms into making incorrect predictions." The concept was audacious, essentially creating fake cyber attack histories that would fool enemy algorithms into preparing for threats that would never materialize, while leaving them vulnerable to countermeasures they couldn't anticipate. It was like conducting a magic trick on a global scale, misdirecting sophisticated artificial intelligence systems through carefully crafted deception. "How long would you need to generate convincing false histories?" President Walsh asked, understanding immediately that time remained our most critical constraint. 3 hours to write the deception algorithms, another hour to deploy them across all compromised networks, I replied, already beginning to sketch out the code architecture I would need. But we'd have to coordinate the deployment perfectly. If even one system comes online out of sequence, the entire deception could be exposed. General Martinez had been monitoring communications with other agencies throughout our conversation. "Captain, I'm getting reports that the attackers have accelerated their timeline. Intelligence estimates now suggest they could launch their primary assault within 6 hours instead of 8. The shortened timeline sent adrenaline coursing through my system. What had already been a nearly impossible task had just become exponentially more difficult. But sometimes impossible deadlines forced innovations that wouldn't have emerged under normal circumstances. "Then we adapt," I said, turning back to the workstations with renewed determination. "Colonel Hayes, I need you to start preparing deployment packages for every compromised system we've identified. General Martinez, can your staff coordinate with Pentagon's Cyber Command to ensure simultaneous implementation across all affected networks?" "Already in progress," she replied, gesturing toward staff members who were working at stations throughout the laboratory. "We've established direct communication links with response teams at NSA, Cyber Command, and Homeland Security. When you're ready to deploy, we can push your countermeasures to every affected system within minutes." As I began writing code that would hopefully save the country's cyber infrastructure, my mind wandered briefly to the wedding reception I had abandoned hours earlier. My brother's celebration was probably winding down by now, with guests heading home to discuss the unprecedented evening they had witnessed. They would talk about Air Force One landing on the estate lawn and the president personally retrieving the family's disappointment for reasons none of them could understand. But understanding wasn't really necessary. What mattered was that for the first time in my adult life, my work was being recognized at its true value rather than being dismissed as meaningless government employment. The skills my father had considered worthless were now the focal point of a presidential mission that could determine the security of the entire nation. "Captain," President Walsh said quietly, appearing beside my workstation as I dove deeper into the code development process. "I want you to know that regardless of how this turns out, you've already proven something important tonight." Ma'am, you've proven that expertise and dedication matter more than social status or family approval. The work you do in service to your country has value that can't be measured in stock portfolios or country club memberships. Tonight, you're not just defending computer networks, you're defending the ideals that make this country worth protecting. Her words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, coming from someone who understood both the burden of service and the price of standing alone against forces that seemed overwhelming. As I returned to my work, I felt a sense of purpose that transcended personal vindication or family approval. This wasn't about proving my worth to people who had never understood it. This was about honoring the oath I had taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The code began flowing across my screens as algorithms took shape that might represent our only hope of defeating an enemy who had turned my own innovations against the country I loved. Somewhere in cyberspace, Dr. Patricia Volkov was preparing to launch an assault that could bring America to its knees. But she had made one critical error in her calculations. She had underestimated the woman who had created the very systems she was now trying to destroy. 3 hours into what felt like the most intense coding session of my life, the screens around me displayed a complex web of interconnected algorithms that represented our best hope of defeating an enemy who had weaponized my own work. The deception framework was taking shape, but each line of code had to be perfect. A single error could expose our countermeasures and leave us defenseless against the coming assault. My fingers had developed their own rhythm across the keyboard, translating strategic concepts into executable instructions with the fluidity that came from years of experience in high-pressure situations. The artificial attack histories I was creating had to be sophisticated enough to fool advanced artificial intelligence systems, while remaining internally consistent across multiple data points. It was like writing an elaborate fiction that had to pass scrutiny from the most advanced analytical tools ever developed. "Status report, Captain," President Walsh requested, her voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the laboratory's cooling systems. She had maintained her vigil throughout the night, receiving periodic updates from agencies across the government while allowing me to work without interference. "The primary deception algorithms are complete," I replied, highlighting sections of code that would create false patterns in network traffic analysis. "I'm now working on the historical injection protocols that will make our fake data appear authentic to Markov chain analysis systems." Dr. Volkov taught those systems to look for specific signatures in attack patterns, so I need to create false signatures that match her expectations perfectly. Colonel Hayes appeared at my shoulder, studying the cascading lines of text that represented months of compressed development work. "How confident are you that this approach will be effective?" "Honestly, about 60%, I admitted, pausing in my typing to consider the variables involved. "The theoretical framework is sound, but we're essentially trying to perform surgery on a patient who's actively fighting back. Even if our deception works initially, sophisticated attackers will adapt quickly once they realize they're being misdirected." General Martinez had been coordinating with response teams throughout the government, and her expression suggested that external pressures were mounting alongside our technical challenges. "Captain, I'm getting reports that preliminary probing attacks have intensified over the past hour. The adversaries appear to be testing response times across multiple target networks." The escalation wasn't entirely unexpected, but it confirmed that we were racing against opponents who weren't sitting idle while we developed countermeasures. Dr. Volkov would be monitoring defensive preparations, looking for signs that her former colleagues were mounting organized resistance to her assault plans. "That's actually good news," I said, returning to my keyboard with renewed focus. Increased probing means they're still gathering intelligence rather than launching their primary attack. If they were confident in their preparation, they would have moved to the execution phase already. President Walsh moved to examine the main display, where network diagrams showed the current scope of enemy infiltration across government systems. Red indicators marked confirmed compromises, while yellow warnings highlighted systems showing suspicious activity that hadn't yet been fully categorized. The pattern resembled an infection spreading through the digital circulatory system of American government operations. "Walk me through what happens when we deploy these countermeasures," she requested, her tone reflecting the kind of strategic thinking that had made her one of the most effective presidents in recent memory. What should we expect in terms of enemy response? I stood up from my workstation and moved to the main display, using a laser pointer to highlight different aspects of our defensive strategy. Phase 1 involves simultaneous deployment of false historical data across all compromised networks. This should trigger enemy algorithms to prepare for attack scenarios that won't actually occur, essentially causing them to waste resources defending against threats that don't exist. The president nodded, following my explanation with the focused attention of someone who understood that details mattered when dealing with national security crises. And Phase 2? Phase 2 exploits the window of confusion created by our false data injection. While enemy systems are recalibrating their attack strategies based on misleading information, we'll deploy new defensive protocols that use completely different analytical frameworks from anything Dr. Volkov has seen before. Colonel Hayes studied the deployment timeline displayed on one of the auxiliary screens. The coordination requirements are extraordinary. We're talking about pushing updates to hundreds of systems across multiple agencies within a 15-minute window. If even one deployment fails or occurs out of sequence, the entire operation could be compromised. Which is why we need backup plans, I replied, returning to my workstation to begin developing contingency protocols. I'm creating multiple variants of the deception algorithms, each designed to work independently if the coordinated approach fails. It's not as elegant as a unified deployment, but it provides redundancy if something goes wrong. The next hour passed in a blur of increasingly complex code development as I refined the countermeasures and prepared them for real-world deployment. The laboratory had become a nerve center, where some of the country's most advanced cybersecurity experts worked alongside presidential staff to coordinate what amounted to the largest defensive cyber operation in American history. At exactly 4:17 a.m. Mountain Time, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. General Martinez rushed to her communications station, her face growing pale as she received reports from monitoring stations across the country. "We've got major escalation," she announced, her voice cutting through the sudden tension that filled the laboratory. "Enemy forces have just launched coordinated probing attacks against power grid control systems in California, Texas, and New York." The news sent ice through my veins. Power grid attacks represented a significant escalation beyond the intelligence gathering and military system penetration we had been tracking. If successful, such attacks could leave millions of Americans without electricity, heat, or the basic infrastructure necessary for modern life to function. "Are the attacks succeeding?" President Walsh asked, her command presence intensifying as the crisis deepened. "Preliminary reports suggest they're testing response times and defensive capabilities rather than attempting immediate disruption," General Martinez replied after consulting with her staff. "But the sophistication level is unprecedented. They're using techniques we've never encountered before." I felt a surge of recognition as I studied the attack patterns being displayed on our monitors. "Those aren't new techniques," I said, my voice tight with the realization of what I was seeing. "Dr. Volkov is using advanced APTRS protocols that were developed during the classified Phase 4 of our project. Phase 4 was never officially implemented, but the theoretical frameworks exist in our development archives." Colonel Hayes turned to stare at me with an expression of growing alarm. Phase 4 protocols were designed to penetrate hardened infrastructure targets that normal cyber weapons couldn't touch. If she has access to those specifications, she could shut down everything from nuclear power plants to water treatment facilities, I finished, the full scope of the threat finally becoming clear. This isn't just about military networks anymore. She's targeting the civilian infrastructure that keeps American society functioning. President Walsh had been listening to our exchange with the kind of focused intensity that preceded decisive action. "Captain, how does this change our defensive strategy?" "It accelerates everything," I replied, my mind racing through the implications of this new intelligence. "The deception algorithms I've developed were designed primarily for military networks. Civilian infrastructure uses different security protocols and operates under different threat assumptions. I need to adapt our countermeasures to protect systems that were never designed to withstand this level of sophisticated attack." The next 2 hours became a desperate race against time as I worked to expand our defensive capabilities beyond their original scope. The false historical data that would fool military AI systems needed to be translated into formats that could protect civilian networks operating on completely different technological foundations. It was like trying to perform multiple complex surgeries simultaneously while the patients were under active assault. Status update from the field teams, General Martinez announced as dawn began to break over the Colorado mountains. Enemy probing attacks have ceased across all targeted systems. Intelligence estimates suggest they're entering final preparation phases for a coordinated assault. I looked up from my screens, where the final lines of code were taking shape after the most intensive night of development work in my career. How much time do we have? Best estimate is 90 minutes until they launch their primary attack, she replied grimly. Can your countermeasures be ready for deployment within that time frame? They'll have to be, I said, initiating the final compilation processes that would transform my algorithms into deployable defensive tools. Colonel Hayes, begin preparing the deployment packages. We're going to need flawless execution across every compromised system simultaneously. President Walsh approached my workstation as the laboratory buzzed with preparation activity. Captain, I need to ask you a direct question. In your professional assessment, what are our chances of success? I paused in my work to consider the question honestly. We were attempting something that had never been tried before, using theoretical concepts to defend against an adversary who understood our capabilities better than most of our own analysts. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Ma'am, if this were a conventional military engagement, I'd say our chances were minimal, I replied, meeting her gaze directly. But Dr. Volkov made one critical mistake in her planning. She assumed that the student could never surpass the teacher. Tonight, she's about to discover that assumption was wrong. The president smiled grimly, the expression of someone who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. Then let's prove her wrong, Captain. Let's show the world what American innovation can accomplish when our backs are against the wall. As the final minutes counted down toward deployment, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was the moment everything in my career had been building toward. Not just the technical skills I had developed over 15 years of service, but the mental toughness forged through countless nights of challenging work, and the resilience built through years of family disappointment. The woman who had been dismissed as a failed investment at her brother's wedding was about to launch the most sophisticated cyber defense operation in human history. And somewhere in the depths of my determination, I knew that Patricia Volkov was about to learn that betraying your country came with consequences she had never imagined. Initiate deployment sequence in 10 seconds, I announced, my finger hovering over the execution key that would launch our countermeasures across every compromised network simultaneously. The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of servers processing terabytes of deceptive data designed to confuse enemy algorithms. President Walsh stood behind me, her presence a reminder that the next few minutes could determine whether American infrastructure survived the night intact. 3, 2, 1, execute. Across the country, our false historical data flooded into compromised systems like digital antibodies, fighting a technological infection. Within seconds, enemy algorithms began recalibrating their attack strategies based on misleading patterns that suggested vulnerabilities where none existed. It's working, Colonel Hayes reported, watching network monitors that showed enemy systems responding exactly as predicted. Their reconnaissance protocols are chasing phantom targets. But Dr. Volkov wasn't finished. Warning indicators began flashing as she deployed countermeasures I hadn't anticipated. Adaptive algorithms that could distinguish between authentic and fabricated data patterns. She's adapting faster than expected, I muttered, initiating backup protocols, deploying Phase 2 defensive measures now. The next 20 minutes became a high-speed chess match played across cyberspace, with each move countered by increasingly sophisticated responses. Finally, enemy activity ceased entirely. All hostile network activity has stopped, General Martinez announced. Systems are showing normal operational parameters across all monitored networks. President Walsh placed her hand on my shoulder. Outstanding work, Captain. You've just saved the country. Hours later, as Air Force One carried us back toward North Carolina, I received a text from Marcus. Reception's still going. Dad wants to apologize. Says he never understood what you really do. Looking out at the sunrise painting the mountains golden below us, I smiled. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't measured in battles won, but in respect finally earned from those who matter most. The family that had called me useless had learned that service to the country creates value beyond any stock portfolio. And the woman they had dismissed as a failed investment had just proven that honor, duty, and expertise matter more than social status or wealth. My name is Captain Sarah Morrison. I serve my country, and I finally understand that's worth more than any approval I was seeking. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.